In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains why you become severely anxious and how to heal from it.
That has real world consequences. I mean, one of the things that happens when people develop panic disorder, what seems to happen is that I can tell you the typical story about how you would develop panic disorder with agoraphobia, because the two things are somewhat separate. So generally it generally happens to women. It generally happens in their 40s. Women are more susceptible to anxiety and depression, and men, just so you know, are more susceptible to substance abuse and antisocial behavior. Now, okay, so back to the agoraphobic. So what happens to her usually is, generally, these are people who've had dependent relationships, and so perhaps they had a relatively overprotective family, or let's just say protective family, and then they had an intimate relationship early in their life, and maybe that lasted for quite a long time, or maybe they're still married to the same guy. But and inside that relationship, she's relatively dependent, which means probably she doesn't go anywhere without her husband, and she doesn't do a lot of things autonomously, let's say. Okay, so then she hits menopause, and she's getting some strange physiological symptoms from that, of various sorts. And then maybe at the same time, maybe she talks to her husband about a divorce, or maybe he talks to her about a divorce, or maybe her sister gets divorced, or maybe a close friend dies, or maybe she starts to experience heart palpitations because of menopause. And then she thinks, oh my God, that could happen to me. It's like my whole world could fall apart. And so that's one fear, my whole world could fall apart. So that's sort of the fear of societal catastrophe, the collapse of the structure. And then the other fear is often, oh my God, I could be dying of a heart attack. And so what happens to people who start to develop panic disorder is that they end up going to the emergency room all the time to be checked out by cardiologists. And the cardiologists are used to this, and they generally check people out quite extensively. But most of the time, if there's something up with your heart, there's nothing wrong. But there could be. And so then so what happens is the person who is developing agoraphobia starts thinking perhaps about what would happen if her husband died, or if they got divorced. And then she starts thinking about the fact that, well, she doesn't really know what she'd do, and she doesn't really know how to take care of a bunch of things, and how she might take care of the finances and so forth. And so she has no real place to turn. And so then she makes the fatal mistake. She goes out and she starts to panic, and then she goes home. That's not good. So if you ever develop severe anxiety, the one thing you don't want to do is avoid because of it. Because as soon as you avoid because of it, it gets worse. And the reason for that is, imagine her anxiety systems are trying to figure out how afraid she should be. And it ranges from panic-stricken to none. Well, the anxiety systems have all sorts of sources of input because they're trying to calculate a very difficult problem. Like if, when this thing flickered, one of the things that everyone does is look around. And the reason you do that, it's called referencing, social referencing. It's like, well, how upset should I be about this? What's going on? You look at everyone's face and you see, well, they're upset or they're not upset, and everybody kind of comes to an average agreement about how upsetting this is, and we do that very, very rapidly, And we estimate how anxious we should be by our default neuroticism, so I would say, generally speaking, if you have higher levels of negative emotion rather than lower levels, what happens is that the severity that you estimate a given uncertain event to exist, to have, is higher than the severity someone else might estimate if they were more emotionally stable. And then there's another input, which is, well, roughly how competent do people around you and you think you are? Because, how afraid you should be is actually somewhat proportionate to how competent you are, right? I mean, if you're a well-practiced hunter and you're out in the forest and a bear charges you, it's like, well, maybe you've seen 100 bears and you know what to do, and it's like it's a bear and all that, but you're not going to run. And so then the bear probably won't think you're prey. because the bear thinks that if you run, that you're edible. Now the thing that's really interesting is that if you watch yourself run, then your brain thinks you're edible too. So that's another input. So the anxiety system is doing this terribly difficult calibration job, which is, okay, something happened, how upset should I be? Well, how upset are other people? You know, what's my physiological response? How does it compare to other times I was upset? What are my options? That's a good one, because one of the things the anxiety system really wants is it wants you to come up with a plan. It doesn't really care what the plan is, although you have to believe it, because it's not really a sophisticated cognitive system. It's an alarm bell, and it says, look, something's up here. You have to knit up your world again and put it to rest. We need to be able to ignore everything again. And if you can't do that, that thing will just go off forever. That's what happens, at least in part, to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. They're soldiers, you know, and maybe they've gone out in battle and they've watched themselves do terrible things, because that's actually one of the most common precedents of post-traumatic stress disorder. And they have no idea how to represent that in their hierarchical world model. You know, because part of your world model, a huge part of it, the what is part, you know, is who you are. Well, it's like you might find out that you're not who you are, who you think you are. You're not even who you think you are a little tiny bit. Like there's corners and nooks and whole unexplored rooms inside of you that contain things that, if they ever come out, like you're done. You don't know what to do with it, you know. And if you've dealt with someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder, it's very frequently the case that they have to learn a philosophy of good and evil in order to recover. And it has to be sophisticated because they've seen these terrible destructive forces at work, and their old world model is just not handling it, you know. So